Hi, and welcome to another episode of Red Talks. I am Nathan Pierce, your host, and I have two very interesting guests with me this week. I have Tom McGonagle, who's from F5 Networks. He's been working as a DevOps engineer for about 9 years now, which is kind of cool. And with him, I also have Dr. David Yates even, who's actually an associate professor of computer information systems. Yeah, I'm reading off the screen over here at Bentley University, who's got a lot of hands-on work with Agile and DevOps. So I'm going to get these guys to give a bit of their background because it's a lot more than what I just shared with you. Guys, introduce yourselves. First person who speaks gets to go first.
After you, David.
Okay, Tom, I'll go first. So I've been doing hands-on work in networking now for, more than 2 decades. I teach infrastructure and networking at Bentley. I've worked in industry for companies like InfoLibria, have a dozen patents there. In academia, I've published work in this area as well, really all around networked and information and communication technologies. I also am a specialist in multi-tiered applications, fluent in a number of tools and business and data analytics tool as well. Not surprisingly, I have a master's and a PhD in computer science. And that's probably all you need to know about me. Tom, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tom McGonagle. I'm an SC at F5 Networks. And like Nathan said, I have 9 years of DevOps experience, which is kind of a lot. And I started with Puppet, and I had my own Puppet consulting company. And then I went to Booz Allen Hamilton, and I was a DevOps strategy consultant. And then I went on to Red Hat, and I was a site reliability engineer. And then I went on to CloudBees and was a DevOps consultant, specializing in continuous delivery and kind of DevOps in general. And I have 2 degrees from Bentley University, and that's how I know David. David's what I refer to as my DevOps partner in crime. And he and I have done a ton of work together at Booz Allen Hamilton and then various other projects together. And I have, and just Nathan, it's a tremendous pleasure to be on Red Talks. And I love ranting and I love DevOps with my whole heart. So it's just great to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for both joining. I'm now the one who feels least qualified to be on this channel. That's some pretty hefty experience and knowledge you guys have there. I'm not even wearing shoes that have laces on them, just to give a bit of context as to where I fit in all of this. So thank you guys for joining us. Now, just before we actually started this episode, I was having a bit of a side chat with Tom there. And I was just asking, what's the kind of state of the land right now? Like, where are people's understanding of DevOps and these practices? Do you want to just share what you started telling me before, Tom?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, I worked at CloudBees, which is the Jenkins company. And based on kind of my experience with continuous delivery, like every problem basically looks like a continuous delivery problem to me. And so I have a demo that uses Jenkins and Ansible to configure a big IP device. And I gave a presentation to some customers today, and it didn't go well. They were just completely mystified by this tool chain and the automation that was possible with it. And immediately after that meeting, I had a meeting with another customer that was doing the exact same thing with TFS. And it was a DevOps meeting, and it was just, I went from the lowest of the lows to the highest of the highs in these two SE meetings, and it was just an incredible experience. And it shows just the breadth and the depth of DevOps experience and interest in automation that's out in the field. And it was a very eye-opening experience. And as Nathan said, we were chatting about it before the podcast began.
That's interesting, and that's the same kind of experience as I come along a lot. And I think it depends. It gives you a very quick gauge on how siloed some organizations are over another. Like if you go into, say, a NetOps team and talk to the network people, and they are like, what's a Jenkins? What? I've never heard of this thing. And then you go to another organization, and they're like, oh my God, I get asked every week how I'm going to integrate into this tool. So I think that's a huge gauge of culture within an organization and whether they're ready maybe to even make this kind of this jump, this evolutionary change. I mean, the ones that they already know about the tools, they're already reading about these things. A good qualifier is, do you know what the Phoenix project is? I find that's a nice step in as well. Now, we set this meeting up with you guys have already like do a lot of talking and a lot of thinking about all of this, and you're very well versed in like the principles of DevOps and the practices of that and what it all means. And but why don't you just explain that to us? I mean, let's help our listeners understand a bit of how to carve all this up and understand where they are and where they need to get to.
Okay, so Tom, if it's okay with you, why don't I talk people through the principles for a bit, and we'll pause and let Nathan chime in if he has questions or want to steer us, and then maybe
I'll represent the people who don't wear shoes with laces.
Okay.
And ask all the stupid questions.
Right, and then Tom, maybe you can take the practices.
Sure.
You want to do it that way?
Sure.
So the three ways, going back to the Phoenix project for a bit, the three ways are articulated probably best in the DevOps handbook, which is hot off the press, by the way. I'd highly recommend the book. I got it as one of the reviewers, so I have a free copy at home, signed by Gene Kim, so that's my souvenir. But he really talks about three things in that book, and this is a culmination of experience that's almost as long as Tom's, so hopefully this resonates with Tom as well. So the first principle is looking at the Dev and Ops pipeline, if you will, in the feed-forward direction and applying systems thinking to that. So you just talked about continuous delivery. That's one of the things. The other thing that's happened as part of the Agile and DevOps movement is really thinking about testing and QA as a first class object. So how do you pull that left in the pipeline, if you will, do it early, do it often, and all of the continuous things that are done iteratively and incrementally as part of the practices. And I'll let Tom speak to that. The second way is what I call continuous intelligence. So if you have all of this infrastructure out there monitoring your distributed infrastructure or distributed application, how do you make sense of it all? So how do you pull it all into a central location and go through log files, go through XML files, go through JSON files, and make sense as to what was happening in your application and your infrastructure? And I'm sure this is near and dear to F5's world, and trying to fuse those together and really understand what's happening is particularly challenging.
Yeah, good point. Good point there.
The other thing, which is called the third way, is continuous learning. And I think this is something that I think Kim does a really great job of talking about in any of his Enterprise Summit talks, and if any of you've seen him live. But it's about the fact that, he puts it in pretty harsh terms, like fail early and fail often. I'm not saying you should plan from failure, but you should learn from your failures. And also you should not be afraid to take risks. Maybe if you work for TurboTax, you shouldn't be taking risks between April 10th and April 15th. But in January and February, take some risks and see what sort of feedback you get from customers. And so this is part of experimentation. And the other part of that is you can only learn by practicing things. So if you look at the so-called unicorns of DevOps, these are the companies that have sort of mastered the craft, if you will. Amazon is one of them. Netflix is another. There's, dozens of others that are talked about. How do you keep practicing and getting better within your own culture and with your own development practices, if you will? And, I think another hard part of that, back to your point earlier, Nathan, is getting the switch and the routing infrastructure and the load balancing infrastructure to all sort of sing off the same sheet of music, if you will, and actually support the applications in a way that serves them best is part of the art and science of that.
Yeah, I like that last example you gave there of, you can't, there are organizations out there, Twitters, your Facebooks, your Googles or whatever. They do have that luxury of tens of thousands of skilled programmers that can look at anything and be like, oh yeah, I can see this XML's coming in and it's just not getting the next engine, and then, well, okay, it's no surprise. But not everyone has that luxury. But like, as you were saying though, you don't have to jump straight into what I always refer to as the Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines model, where no people exist anymore. Right. You can experiment, and you can just start cutting out things that you do repetitively all the time, and just start automating those bits. Like, there's always something to be looking at and to taking out of your day-to-day process. So I think there are very many stages to go along. We shouldn't be intimidated by the fact that there is this, these Googles and Facebooks and Twitters out there that do have these totally autonomous kind of environments. We don't all have to start out on day one with the Simian Army, which was developed by Netflix. And for those who don't know, they've written software that attacks their software so that they can ensure that it's always running. The idea being that if their own software can attack software, it should recover without human intervention. It should be runnable by the most minimal set of people.
Yeah, that's a great example. You don't have to
start there on day one.
Right. That's a great example. The Simian Army and the what is it? The Chaos Monkey as well. Yeah. No,
there we go. Or Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines. I mean, you don't want to go too far because that's the end of the human race. I mean,
right.
It's bad.
So those are sort of very technical, very data-driven activities. And as you get more mature about systems thinking, continuous intelligence, continuous learning, you obviously get better at it. But there's sort of mantras that go with that, and these are mantras that I think Tom, because he's always been customer focused as a consultant or as a sales engineer in what he does, he'll give better voice to this than I do. But the whole idea that teams have to sort of unite together. And one of the things that really unites teams in a DevOps environment is a common mission. And, quarter over quarter, this might change depending on what your OKRs are, to borrow Google's term. But what you really need to do is have a mission that's either customer focused or internally focused about what are you going to do? What are you going to get better at? And having that mission focus around what you're doing in your DevOps environment is incredibly important. And I don't know what that is at F5 these days, but obviously part of it, as Tom just described, is customer education. And this is, internal customers as well as external customers.
Yeah, Tom, what's your thoughts there? I couldn't agree more with what you're saying.
Yeah, so just from my own personal perspective, DevOps. One of the major aspects of DevOps is the DevOps culture, and there's principles that are described as CAMs: culture, automation, monitoring, and sharing. And the sharing is really what's critical as a DevOps engineer, as a DevOps consultant, or as a DevOps SME, at F5, is you have this fiduciary responsibility to share these ideas and these idea viruses. And one of the idea viruses that I'm really hot on right now is the idea of agile networking, which you and I have talked about out of band. And it's my language around the application of agile and DevOps principles to the field of network engineering. And it's what I'm most passionate about right now. And it's what I'm focused on. And it's what I'm trying to live my life and my career to do and to be focused on. And and once again, it's part and parcel of just being a part of the DevOps community. You have to share. As part of my sharing, David and I organized the Boston Jenkins area meetup group, and it's the largest meetup group, largest Jenkins meetup group in the world. And that's just, and it's just part of getting out into the community and getting people aware of DevOps and interested in it.
I did not know that about your Jenkins meetup. I'm going to have to book some flights and come and check that out.
At any time. We'd love to have you speak.
So do you want to talk us through these 9 practices then of
yeah, please. So I'd love to. And so both of you guys, if you could stop me, if you could ask questions, if we could really tease out a great definition for each of these 9 practices. And so the very first one is configuration management. And so it's management of your configurations. And it's people, I think, make the mistake of thinking of it as just your configs, whether they're for a network device or whether they're for an operating system or whether they're for something else, and then storing them in a version control system like Git. But it's not as simple as that. It's much more complex. You can templatize those config files, and you can drive configuration with tools like Puppet and Ansible and Chef, so that you have these autonomic infrastructures, these infrastructures that self-build themselves and self-configure themselves and self-automate and facilitate the configuration of your infrastructure. And so I just want to pause there and see if you guys have any comments about configuration management.
I think if you're in a situation where you're copying and pasting out of whatever system and into a terminal prompt or SSH prompt, you've not done that yet. It's a person doing that copy paste. Well,
That's
if
right.
all they're doing is a copy paste each time and then tweaking some of those commands for each individual one, that can be templatized and automated, surely.
Surely. And so that I would say to a customer or a client that it should be the goal. The very first practice is your entry point into DevOps. Your goal should be automation of your configurations. And so I think that should be the goal, and I mean that sincerely.
So Tom, I guess Nathan was talking earlier about, the advantages some of the customers have in this realm where, the Netflix of the world have thousands and thousands of customers, and as do the Facebook. So those are social media. Amazon is another one, which is retail. I know you've had customers in financial services where you've seen some really advanced best practices. So what are the best practices around configuration management that you've seen beyond, it should be automated, you shouldn't be cutting and pasting into an SSH window? Are there things that you can talk about?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question, David. Thank you. So whether you're talking about Chef, whether you're talking about Puppet, or whether you're talking about Ansible, they all have this concept of facts about the system. So when they first run on a system, they gather all this intelligence about the environment, about the server, about the big IP, about the switch. And what you can do is you can use those intelligence variables as part of your configuration management. And I've used it to have self-building infrastructures that I would embed the role of a server in the host name, and then when the host bootstrapped and ran Puppet would self-configure it to a www server or a database server or what have you. But so using these facts about your system to drive your configuration is probably the best example of a best practice in configuration management that I can think of.
That's a great example, yeah.
Yeah, so not only are the systems self-identifying, but they're self-configuring as well. That's pretty amazing.
That's Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines talk right there.
It is, it really is. So I guess I'm going to pull on that thread a bit. So it seems to me that if you're sort of configuring all of that data that gives you your identity, you must have a good idea. And I'm jumping now to practice number 7, which is continuous monitoring for your listeners. What are the best practices you see there as well? Is there some kind of analog or metaphor between the sort of configuration piece and the monitoring piece that you see?
Yeah, so I attended a meetup last night. It was a DevOps meetup, and it was on metrics-driven DevOps. And what it was is application, it's APM, David. I'm drawing a blank on what APM stands for. It's application performance
monitoring, yeah.
And so it's instrumenting your code to expose various various qualities about your code and about your infrastructure to a metrics gathering tool. And so you have your code actually self-identifying and telling you if there's a problem, telling you what the mean time between failures were, telling you that it's not that it ran into a heat problem or what have you. It's this metrics driven DevOps, I think, is a tremendous approach to the topic of monitoring. And when I mentioned CAMs earlier, the M in CAMs is monitoring, but metrics driven DevOps is a more interesting example of that. It's a more it's a much more important and analytical approach to your infrastructure. That includes your networking infrastructure. That includes your big IPs.
I think if you take the metrics out, then it's very assumptions based. like if you're removing the metrics, let's say I'm deploying a service and I'm unaware of the current performance and state of the infrastructure, be it physical or virtual, that I'm deploying it to, then I have to assume that it's got enough resource to handle the workload. Or if it's a deployed service and I want to edit it, I want to increase its capability, its scale, and spread it across more virtual machines or containers. Again, if I don't have the metrics, I'm making really big assumptions. So the difference between that lack of metrics when applying that to deploying configurations, etc., one of them's fingers crossed networking, which is the copy and paste. You're basically doing the same without the metrics, versus intelligent decisions. In fact, that deployment, if it was automated, should know the difference of being able to say, hey, you know what? We don't have the resources right now. I'm not going to deploy it.
Right. No, that's a great example. So if I could just jump around for a minute. So one of I think the big motivators for DevOps that's not given enough voice is the whole idea that it's marrying modern management and IT best practices. So I have sort of 4 books that when I'm in the classroom, I bring them to the first night, and I said, we won't have time to go through all of these, and I usually have to get more prescriptive in my teaching. But if you look at the Toyota way and what they did to lean, you look at Steven Spear's High Velocity Edge, look at Simon Sinek's Start with Why. These are all of the business reasons that really give DevOps legs from a business point of view. And there's dozens and dozens of brilliant DevOps books out there, including the handbook now out. But Craig Larman, John Alspar, Jez Humble, Les Bass, Inco Weber, these folks that have actually written about DevOps from all kinds of points of view, dating all the way back to 2010, really talk about the IT best practices that go hand in hand with the business best practices. So my theory is that there's a positive feedback loop there between the business requirements and what DevOps delivers. And if you can get past that, I'll call it that walk, crawl, run cycle that Nathan was talking to. So where do you start? Where do you start on this treadmill? And then once you're on it, you'll find that jogging on the treadmill isn't so hard once you do it for a couple of years. And maybe after a couple of years, you can actually run on the treadmill for a bit, and you'll see all of the things that are in modern management and IT best practices come together for your organization. That's my experience anyway.
That's cool. And I think we're starting to touch on kind of the second practice there. We've kind of linked 1 and 7, which were made sense, but this continuous integration is kind of how we pull multiple systems together into this approach. Would that be the next kind of logical step there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I can speak to continuous integration. So I was a CI/CD consultant for CloudBees, and continuous integration has a robot. So Jenkins has the logo for Jenkins is a butler, and what it does is it takes your code from a SCM, from a source code management repository, and then it tests it, it builds it, and it tests it in a continuous way. So every time you have a group of developers, and every time one of the developers commits code, the build server tests it and makes sure it builds it and tests it and makes sure that it passes the tests, the unit tests and the functional tests and all the other tests that are important to a continuous integration pipeline. And it enables development teams and DevOps teams to have awareness of the quality of the code that they're developing.
That's handy. I mean, prior to kind of CI, continuous integration, and continuous delivery, like it was all a manual process. I mean, you built the code, you were testing yourself in siloed environments that didn't necessarily match the environment that it was going to go to, because how could you maintain your environment against their environment? You'd check something in, and then 10 other people would check other things in, and you'd all cross your fingers for the next test run to see if your code didn't clobber someone else's or that kind of craziness. But now the fact that it can just kick off test jobs based on this information that's been provided, I mean, that's fantastic for business, because it's all about keeping that developer focused 100% of the time on 2 things. Either creating applications and services that generate revenue or that improve productivity. I mean, if there's a third, please share. They're the 2 I think that they need to be focused on all the time, though. And as soon as you're pulling them out of that to manually go and run any kind of like build process or frameworks, I mean, that's taking them off of that key fundamental, keep the business running activity that they really should be doing.
I think that's very well put, Nathan. And I wonder, and just to bring it back to the field of agile networking, what does continuous integration look like for agile networking, and what are the tests that we should be running on router configs in an automated way? What are the tests that we should be running on ADCs in an automated way to ensure that the configuration, the changes and the updates to the configuration are in fact valid and useful and effective. And so one of those tests is called linting. And I don't know what the word comes from. Maybe David might know from his computer science experience. But what it does is it basically looks at the and make sure that the colons are in the right place and that the spaces are in the right place and there isn't white space, and it looks at the overall picture of the config file and make sure that it is appropriately formatted. And just that one simple test can eliminate an enormous amount of errors. And it's just one simple test that you can orchestrate through a tool like Jenkins.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think lint is an old, I'm showing my age here. It was one of the first tools that would literally go through source code and identify either poor coding or poor commenting practices. So it was literally going through, your dryer filter looking for lint, if you will, except the dryer filter in this case was your code. Probably not a great metaphor, but that's the history of that term. The automated testing piece is a huge piece. So as I was hearing you talk about what developers should be doing, the only footnote I had there, Nathan, was that, do all of these things, but, when you write a piece of code, make sure that either you or your partner is writing a test for it so that you never get behind that automation curve. So somewhere down the road, you might test your code by hand on your screen in front of you, but somewhere down the road, you're going to have that test code already written and you can build it into your CI infrastructure. And so practice 2 and practice 3, continuous integration and automated testing, almost go hand in hand, because if you're checking in code to the CI/CD pipeline, you want to make sure that you're checking in test code side by side with it, regardless of if it's adding value or taking out risk. Right.
I've heard some people go by the philosophy of write the unit test first.
Yes.
Before you then write the code, because actually, if you can't come up with the test, what are you writing?
Yeah,
I thought that was a really interesting approach, kind of switching around the other way, and maybe that's the way that we test for programmable infrastructure.
So that's actually Kent Beck would pat you on the back for saying that, Nathan. So that's actually one of the core principles of the XP Agile framework. It's called test-driven development, and it's literally test first, write the test first. When I teach security, I actually think that is the right way to think about security. In other words, if you're about to roll something out that's going to improve security of your infrastructure, how do you know it's working? How do you know that you haven't introduced other vulnerabilities? In other words, how do you test the wall that you've put up, and how do you test that you can't go around that wall by the way you've introduced it? So I'm a big believer in test-driven development, especially for security infrastructure.
That security one's interesting because now we're starting to think like the chaos monkey.
Yeah.
Let's work out how I'd prove it wasn't working.
Yeah, exactly.
Put the security in, because it's the only way I'm really going to know.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, good philosophy. So yeah, we've kind of, we've linked the first 4 there together nicely, and well, the first 3, but infrastructure as code, we talked a little bit about that, and I think 4 is obviously a big one, especially when it's when we got people from F5 Networks here. It's very much infrastructure, and how do we get that into this software code kind of management thinking? Tell us what you think, Thomas.
Yeah, so I think it's critical to think of what infrastructure as code is as a software development project for your infrastructure. And what does that mean? You get all the benefits of a software development project. You get to use Agile. You get to use Git repositories and social coding, and you get to use peer review and all the benefits that you get as a software developer. It's applied to your infrastructure, and it's been traditionally applied to cloud-based infrastructures, but that's not necessarily true anymore. We have at F5, we have the Ansible playbooks, excuse me, the Ansible modules that can allow quite a bit of configuration for a big IP device, and you can set up GTM, you can set up LTM, you can flash and upgrade software, you can configure I rules, you can create UCS files. There's quite a bit of functionality that's available as code. And what does that get you? It allows you to manage your big IP as a software project, and then take advantage of all of the tremendous amount of software development best practices that have been created over the last 20 years. Would you say that's a pretty good description, David? Do you have anything?
Yeah, no, it's spot on. I think that's spot on. I think you want your infrastructure to be programmable and extensible. And the only way to do that is to sort of bake it into software as much as you can. Obviously, if you're running on a big IP device, it's a hybrid or it's an embedded device that has both hardware and software. There's no getting around that. But the more that you can think about abstracting that out and bringing it into a code base, whether it's the configuration or the firmware or whatever, I think that's the right approach.
I like this idea of taking a configuration for an existing service that is very similar and forking that configuration in a source code management tool, an SCM like Git. I mean, whether you're running GitLabs internally or you're using GitHub externally, and just changing what needs to be changed there. But as soon as you've done that, you've got all those awesome tools that show what was forked, a diff between the previous version and the forked version, and then every change after that. And all of that's logged against the person who did it all. I mean, how can we not manage infrastructure this way? Like, just the audit trail's brilliant.
I'm sure all of your customers are doing all of that, Nathan, which is why, Tom really doesn't have a job. No, I'm just
Exactly. That's why we've all got time to talk about it today. No, this would be an ideal world if we all kind of jumped on that. I know it's hard to change that overnight, like a culture and a practice.
Yeah.
But the benefit of doing that, I mean, using a tool like Jenkins, like if I am managing my configurations that way, and I manage these config files in a source code management tool, then actually I can be having something like Jenkins that I can tell to just prompt for approval before it deploys, and I can quickly just check, what, that is the public IP, those are the servers, yep, no, we're good to go, run.
Right.
That has saved me two things, which are equally as important. One is just time. That is the most precious commodity of all of us. But two is I make typos all the time. I mean, just read my emails. Like, you don't want me in that process.
Right.
Validating that process. So I'm no longer the limiting factor of how long it takes to deploy. But at least my domain knowledge of I've been in F5 for over 10 years now. I have the knowledge to be able to review what was going to get deployed and say, that's pretty much what I would have done, go for it. So it's just a cultural change, really. The same steps are happening, but I'm taking all of my weaknesses out of that path.
Right,
you're keeping an eye on it.
Right, you're making them repeatable, but you're keeping the human in the loop to the extent that as the process that you're repeating evolves, you want a human to inspect those evolutions.
There's a term my boss and I talk about a lot now, reproducible ops. We know it's not a real term, but we talk about that all the time. We're just constantly looking at anything that can be reproducible. So done again and again and again. And let's just eliminate that from people's day.
Right. So I hate to get further down in our list, but what you're talking about there is continuous deployment. Yeah. So you always have this set of master configs that reflects what's in the field now. And what you want to be doing is building and improving on those depending on your security requirements, your application performance requirements, whatever is changing in your environment. So you're sort of staging what's next. And then to me, continuous deployment is about, well, how do you now deploy that? Another term that I love from the unicorns of DevOps that I think we should get on this chat is the notion of a canary release. And what a canary release is, you got something. Maybe it's a big jump, maybe it's a small jump, but you don't put it out everywhere. Maybe you go into one server cluster and lay out the changes that are going to make in that server cluster. And then you sort of watch and observe them for 5 minutes and you say, okay, things seem to be working. And then you roll it out everywhere. In other words, you send out a canary into the coal mine. And if the canary flourishes and flies back to you, then you roll it out everywhere. But it gives you a very quick way to roll back. So the other part of, what did you call it? Repeatable DevOps or reproducible DevOps?
Reproducible ops, yeah.
Reproducible ops is, you've got no choice when you get to sufficient scale. If you're rolling out to, a whole data center or 3 very large data centers, as would be typical in a big enterprise, you've got to do it in small steps, and you can have these validation checks as you're doing it to make sure that you're not stepping on your toes, if you will.
Yeah, good. So we kind of, it's hard to talk about continuous delivery and continuous deployment separately. I mean, there's just that extra step on the end of the workflow. Like, Tom, do you want to just give us a quick run through of how do I know I'm doing one versus the other for our audience?
So if people were to rewind, about 5 minutes and to hear you talk about that push button in the workflow, that's continuous delivery. Continuous delivery includes continuous integration, and then there's a step where the human gets involved and says, okay, I'm going to push this to production. And then that could be every 2 weeks, that could be every day, that could be every hour, whatever it is. But it really is based on the needs of the business. Continuous deployment, on the other hand, is what AWS does. AWS releases code 100 times a day or 1,000 times a day. There's some ridiculous number, and they're continuously updating the Amazon website, not AWS, the Amazon website, and they're continuously updating the code in the infrastructure, and they're continuously making software changes in a continuous manner because they have this microservice-based architecture that allows them to do this. And continuous deployment is different from continuous delivery, but the key to understand is that continuous delivery basically has a button that says go to production, where continuous deployment automatically goes to production.
I think there's a term that just keeps coming to my mind when I'm having conversations like this, not just that last topic, but the whole thing. And the people that we're talking about that are running this infrastructure, that are under pressure to integrate with these automation tool chains. There's a question that someone raised in the previous episode. It was Mark Wall, to just call him out there. He said, "Do you want to be a button pusher or a button creator?" And you just reminded me of it again, then, Tom, when you said about the push button deploy, kind of go to it. And I really like that analogy. Do you want to stay on the CLI in a shrinking area because automation is going to replace that, or do you want to be that button creator, the person who manages that process between the two systems and actually is not in-band of the deployment process, but is out of band of the process but supporting it? And I thought that was a really good analogy for the kind of thing that you're explaining. Like to achieve that goal where it's continuous deployment, continuous delivery, well, you need to take all of the people that are in that pipeline of operations and make them into people who just support that pipeline. Become the button creator, not the button pusher.
I love that. That's a great phraseology, and it speaks volumes. It really does. It really resonates with me. Do you want to be the creator or do you want to be the pusher? And where where do you want to be in that tool chain? And what's going to pay the most, right? Like those types of questions. It really kind of begs those type of questions. I love that. That's great.
I want to be the button creator. I think pushing buttons sounds a little boring. Actually, I think Mark Wall did confess in that last episode that he stole that term from Hitesh Patel, who is actually a global solutions architect for DevOps at F5. So we should probably give him credit for that as well. Hitesh was the guest in the very first REDtalks episode, actually.
Oh, wow.
He made me make a sandwich to prove what the difference between declarative and imperative is. I made a sandwich, and then he just took a burrito out of a wrapper and went, "There's declarative." It's a pretty good example, actually.
Yeah, it's a very good one.
So CI/CD, we kind of covered those two there, and we actually jumped well ahead to monitoring right at the beginning. We kind of linked 1 and 7 that what's the point of deploying things if we don't know how or the circumstance under which it's going to go into? Like that they are extremely linked. I think the monitoring with CAMS, as you mentioned before, the M. So run us through again. CAMS is
culture, automation, monitoring, and sharing. But David and I actually prefer ACAMS Plus, which is agile, culture, automation, monitoring, sharing, plus whatever is important to you. So at F5, it's network and security. So we
like this.
Yeah. So we kind of amalgamated it a little bit.
I like this, and I like that you put that on the front, and because culture is huge. It's all about this creating this agile environment by changing that culture. Like I like the way you link that all up there. Yeah. So the next one on the list, I'm so glad I have the list on this other monitor because I would have been stuck at 2. Let's be honest. Slightly under-caffeinated, I think, today. So the next one was we'll practice 8. It's not a single word like some of those previous, but developing an engaged and inclusive culture to encourage collaboration and shared ownership. I like the last 2 words on that a lot. Shared ownership, because less of this you touched it last and more how do we get this automated and working and into production and onto the next task. Is that what you're getting at there with that one?
That's exactly what we're getting at. So when I was at CloudBees, I had a blog. If you Google Thomas McGonagle, you'll find my CloudBees blog. And I came up with 5 metaphors for DevOps. And my favorite one was football, American football. But another one that I came up with was an Amish barn raising. And so they run the gamut. So if you have any interest in reading some of my blogs from CloudBees, I highly recommend them.
I'll post a link in the article afterwards, actually.
Okay, great. And then so with the football metaphor, it's an inclusive culture. It's a culture where everyone, no matter what their job is, so the offensive guard has the job to block the defensive tackle, but the quarterback has the job to throw the ball, and the halfback has the job to do something else. And everyone has different roles, but they're all working towards the same goal, which is to score a touchdown. And this inclusive, collaborative culture is critical in DevOps. And it's getting the devs and the QA and the NetOps and the SysOps and the other ops guys all working together as a cohesive, collaborative team.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Anything to add to that, David?
Yeah, I'll just chime in here and say that this is one of the things, it's the drum I probably beat the loudest as I'm teaching this stuff in the classroom. So I'm trying to get... now, Bentley is fairly team-oriented in its teaching approach, and I get the seniors at the end of the line that have seen good, bad, and ugly team experiences. And what I try and do is sort of erase all of those and say, okay, you're now collaborating. And I'll borrow from the football metaphor for a minute. You know, your goal is to, in this project, we're going to run, what I do is I have them run 3 sprints using the Scrum methodology over 1 semester. And I said, the most important thing that you can do as part of your team is, you know, collectively and jointly own the product that you're going to deliver at the end of the semester. And so what are you going to do on those 3 sprints to make it the best possible product? And it's a matter of of extracting commitment from your team members, getting them to trust each other, having empathy for each other's point of view. It's you latched onto a very appealing phrase, but it's actually much harder to do than it is to say. So yes, I'm with you. It's just, as someone who has to teach this stuff, there's a lot goes into having students adopt that mentality, as I'm sure you see in your workforce as well as in your customer base, that it's just one of those things that's easy to say and hard to do.
No, good advice there. And that brings us on to 9. I'm a huge fan of 9, maybe too much so. I tend to even throw code out to GitHub before I've even really tested it. Conceptually, the idea's there, but I kind of throw that into the test later. Maybe I should have Jenkins do that for me before I throw it out there. I need to work on that. But yeah, should actively participating in communities, etc. I mean, tell us a bit more about that. So this is stepping out of the silo of your workflow and your deployment and actually looking more out into the community side of things. What tell us a bit more about that.
So once again, this is the S in CAMS, the sharing, and you hit on a great one, which is participating in GitHub, for example, in the GitHub community. It's participating in the Slack ecosystem. There's a great agile networking Slack channel called networktocode.slack.com. I highly recommend that. But it's also getting out of your house and going to meetups and going to conferences and speaking at conferences, or being an organizer for a conference and being a good community participant and being cool and not, like one of the things that I often say to customers is that part of DevOps is there's actually a no jerks rule, because it's so team oriented. You can't be a jerk. It just you're not gonna survive on the team. And so it's, you know, when you're out in the community, it's being a good listener, it's being a nice person, it's being congratulating people when they're done with their speech and telling them that they did a good job. It's, you know, it's just like one of my other CloudBees posts was on Buddhism and DevOps. It's called, and so maybe we can make a link to that as well. And so there's opportunities just to be a nice person and be a part of the community, and the benefit of that is the learning opportunities that it creates. And please.
I'm gonna list these 9 practices when I post the article for this episode, but I'm gonna put in brackets after 9. Don't be a jerk. I think that sums it all up. And I've been going to conferences for I know I only look 22 years old, but I've been going to conferences for 20 plus years. And whenever, like for networking ones, especially going back over 10 years, you know, whenever there's anyone that was like from a development team or whatever, it was always extremely intimidating, the interaction. There was always this very thick wall. I mean, it was horrible. It was never, and then you get into kind of like enterprise deployments. When I was actually a sales engineer for many years, there was always this culture of like, you know, development throwing the app over the fence into the guys that had to deploy it in ops, and the ops guys are just like, what the hell? Like, did you even test this? They'd be like, yeah, we tested it, but did you test it in our environment and see how that was? And there was always this us and them everywhere, though. And I think that for me, one of the best things about DevOps and about jumping back to kind of practice 8 of collaboration, of everyone owning the responsibility of the deployment and the tool chain and the automation, is it immediately takes that away. It just can't exist. They cannot coexist. You can't have an us and them when you're all measured against the successful deployment.
Very well said.
Very well said. Yes, perfectly said.
Perfectly said.
It's really, yeah.
Yes, I like to try and bring at least one bit of value to each of these calls. I'll stop talking. Quit while I'm ahead. So we don't want to run too late on this. I mean, there's a lot of great content here, and I'm hoping we can do a few more of these. I think we could easily deep dive into some of these areas. And listeners, if there's anything you want to know more about, please just throw us a comment at the bottom of the article, and we'd love to hear. I think between us, we could probably talk for days about these types of things from our experiences. But just to close out, I mean, are there any challenges that people should look out for? Like, what's the big stumbling blocks you guys see that people should really be aware of if they're going to start down this path?
David, if you don't mind, I'll go first. You know, my advice as a consultant is, you know, and I've given this speech before a number of times, is be brave. You know, there's so much fear, uncertainty, and doubt out there about DevOps and about automation and orchestration, and people just really struggle with it. But, you know, for the agile networkers out there, you know, we kind of give a prescriptive list of practices, but, you know, get out there and start training and start getting into it, and don't be afraid. And the journey will be an interesting one, and it'll be a beneficial one, and it'll be a valuable one. And so be brave and be nice to each other. And that's pretty much my message.
Yeah, I think I'm going to repeat something that you mentioned, Nathan, and go back to something that we talked about in Practice 9. The first thing is, you know, we have this wonderful language that my wife and I have when we're starting a project, and it's start where you are. So no matter where you are in this journey and how upside down your processes feel internally, and how much us and them you have, you've got to start with that as a reality, and look at how you want to get better and work iteratively and incrementally to improve the state of your own shop, whatever you consider your main pain points to be. In addition to getting out there and being sort of social and socializing your ideas and doing a lot of listening, work on being a lifelong learner of technology development. So my latest example of this, I'll give a shout out to a book that I'm reading now. I'm reading a book called The Checklist Manifesto, and it's written by a surgeon, and it's how to apply checklists to get things right. It's such a simple concept, but there's so many wonderful stories in this book. It has nothing to do with IT, but I'm sitting there with my security hat on thinking about wow, security people should really have these checklists, on their desks everywhere. And so, that's part of me being a lifelong learner. I know it's a very trivial example, but you start reading a book a month, and you'd be surprised how much that stimulates your thinking and gets you into the world of technology development, no matter what you're reading. So,
on that theme, David, last final question, which I'll get you both to answer. If I'm an infrastructure guy and I'm really interested in programmable infrastructure and infrastructure as code, and I want to make this leap, where do I start? What's the first book that's not going to be too intimidating, but really give me an idea of what I should be thinking about?
Wow.
So I'm going to steal the book first, David. So
yeah, go ahead.
Web Operations by you'll have to remind me of the lead author, David.
John Alspar and Jesse Robbins. Yeah.
And so it's a 2000.
So what was that one called, Thomas?
Web Operations.
Web Operations. Okay.
So it's about 20 chapters, and it covers everything, all the practices we talked about today in depth.
Yeah. So I'll jump the rail a bit and go to Gene Kim's, Jez Humble, and John Willis's latest, the DevOps Handbook. It's written more for F5 customers than for F5 people. But as you know, in this business, the more you understand about your customer's world, the more that you can pull their thinking and where they're going into your world. So jump on the application delivery train, if you will, and look at what's coming next. And I think that handbook, the DevOps Handbook by Gene Kim et al., copyright 2016, is a great read.
I would second that. Yes, I've read it also. That is definitely a great one. And just because I can't copy the both of you and say the same thing, I would add on the Phoenix Project. That's one of my favorites as well.
Yep.
Also, a Gene Kim book. That's a good one for painting the picture. I just love the way that book starts out. The insanity. I think everyone's had some experience of that insanity. Yeah. So there's 3 books for you: Web Operations, DevOps Handbook, and the Phoenix Project. That's great places to start, I think, to really understand what the common goal is here that we're all trying to solve. So on that note, this has been a great REDtalks episode. I really appreciate both of your time. Hope we can have you on again at some point. So quick farewells. You've been listening to Dr. David Yates. Say goodbye, David.
Bye. Thank you, Nathan, for having us on.
Pleasure. And Thomas McGonagle.
Bye, guys. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Thomas. And I am Nathan Pierce. Thanks for listening.